I have been sewing for, here is it. Sewing mistakes. I've spent more than 30 years making them, some big, some small, all important lessons learned that I would now like to share with you, dear viewer. Let us take a tumble through some of the iconic pieces of my medieval and Renaissance wardrobe and see what exciting errors we may find. I have been attempting to turn fabric into some semblance of medieval and or Renaissance clothing since I was 14, which would mean almost 30 years at this point. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when I started as a little girl, there was no internet really to speak of. But by the time I was actually seriously sewing, the internet was really just a vast wasteland of chat and porn and had no information really worth knowing or worth considering. And my local libraries were very small, and I didn't even understand that library loan was a thing, nor did I think to ask if it was a thing. So I didn't know that I could get more informative publications by having them sent to me. What that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that I have spent the last 30 years nearly destroying fabric in the quest for sartorial knowledge of a historical type, which means that in my wake I have left a vast graveyard of fabric. And so I would like to prevent you, dear viewer, from making the same mistakes I have over the years. Very honest mistakes, every single one of them extremely rich and informative. But why should you, dear viewer, make the same mistakes when you can learn from mine? So today we're going to be taking a sort of sartorial tour through the history of the Contessa from some of her earlier beginnings, and I will be showing you the major mistakes on each of these garments. So let's dive right in. This beautiful garment here, which, as you notice, it doesn't have sleeves currently. This was a Burgundian style gown in the style of Margaret of York that I designed and made for a coronation in the SCA. But this beautiful gown, silk satin with about 90 hand appliqued, hand stenciled, hand cut out black silk dragons, this gown has a sad story. Namely, I patterned it and I was all by myself. I drafted the pattern myself. I created it, I tested it. I was so proud of it. But what I didn't think about is that I fit this pattern on my mostly bare body, not over top of a kirtle, not over top of a smock. And so my number one first tip to you, dear viewers, is any gown, any piece of clothing that you are making, if it is meant to be worn over something, anything, you must first have those under things, and you must be wearing those under things when you either create your pattern or when you actually fit your garment, because I didn't. Even though this gown fit me absolutely perfectly without anything under it, the second I put on my linen smock and of course the appropriate kirtle, it slid horribly off my shoulders. I mean very badly, because the arm's eye of my kirtle was not the same as the arm's eye here, and this was too tight with all the layers of kirtle and linen undergarment underneath of it. So, number one tip, dear viewer, whatever goes under the garment that you're making, you must first have and wear when fitting the garment that goes over it. And in fact, as you will see, I did this, unfortunately, I made this mistake on two of these garments, these gowns that I created at about the same time and didn't figure out my mistake until I cut them both out and sewn them both. So this one is in the process of being reconstructed to fit over top of kirtles. So unfortunately, what I'm going to have to do is completely rebuild the sleeve cap, because the sleeve cap needs a lot more room. And I did that on this one. As you can see, all the additional pieces I added by trial and error, by literally removing the sleeve, putting on the gown, pulling up the sleeve, and eyeballing where I needed to add pieces based on just where my arm rested and where the sleeve cap did not reach to. And so I've basically had to reconstruct not only the arm's eye, but I also needed to reconstruct the entire back. So I actually had to bring the back up significantly higher to prevent it from sliding off of my shoulders. And then I needed to reconstruct the collar, the turn back collar, to fit that new neckline. And that is the process wherein this gown finds itself. So I could have prevented all of that woe if I had just fit the pattern over top of a smock and a kirtle. If you have any questions about this garment and fitting it and the process, do let me know in the comments below. Cheeky self-promotion time. If you are enjoying this video, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe and the notification bell if you want to know when I launch new things. And if you want to do more to support my work, then consider the super thanks button on YouTube, or maybe becoming a patron on Patreon, which comes with a whole host of perks and extras like access to premium tutorials, multiple hour ones in fact, and discounts on classes. And now back to your regularly scheduled Contessa. Tip number 2. If you are lining a gown, you should hang the lining and the shell for at least a week. Hang them high enough so that they completely hang with no parts being supported by the floor or some other surface, so that gravity can stretch them as they will stretch when they are being worn on your body. If you do not do this, you will get uneven stretching over time, and your lining or your shell will not be the right length. And if your lining, which is most likely to stretch more, because your lining tends to be slightly less full or less heavy than your shell, then what you will end up with is a lining that bags, and that will actually hang lower than the shell, and then it will wear and tear away as it drags on the ground. And that's how you end up with a hemline that looks like this. So this beautiful gown I made many years ago, 2009. This was also part of my royal wardrobe, as it were. And I even remade it in 2015, and I thought I had let it hang long enough, but I will admit I was in a hurry to get it done in time for Known World Medieval and Renaissance Dance Symposium, and so I didn't really let it hang long enough. And so over time, the lining has stretched beyond the shell, and so it has worn away, and I will have to figure out some clever way to patch the bottom, because I don't think I have any more of this silk left, and put in some kind of protective facing, probably, as we see in Beata Osana's Gamora. Tip number 2, hang shell and lining for at least a week so that everything stretches before you actually clean up the hem at the bottom. Speaking of lining, let us talk about bag lining. Tip number 3, bag lining. Don't do it. If you're doing a medieval and or Renaissance garment, or really pretty much any kind of pre-modern garment, there aren't many or any examples of which I'm aware of extant garments or any evidence for bag lining. Bag lining means you sew 2 garments basically entirely, and then you attach one to the other at the neckline and the hemline and the cuffs of the sleeves or the armscye, depending on whether it has sleeves or not. And this creates a kind of baggy interior that will actually hang away from the shell, and it creates a garment that doesn't necessarily drape properly, but more problematically, especially if you don't follow tip number 2, which is hang your lining and hang your shell, then you end up with a lot of extra fabric, usually on the lining, that stretches down below the shell, and it is what drags. And on this Gamora, this cotta, really, that I made in 2001 with nary a clue about anything. That is what has happened to this hemline. As you can see, it's completely worn away because the lining stretched way beyond the shell. And of course, I dance and move everywhere. And so, there's probably, I don't know, at least 2,000 or 3,000 miles danced and or walked in this gown across dirty, scrabbly, rough surfaces. The kind of surfaces that this gown maybe was never actually intended to encounter in its Florentine life, which would have been mostly lived on beautiful marble or wooden parquet floors, or maybe even just smooth stone surfaces on the way to the piazza, where dancing would have happened on a wooden platform covered in beautiful turkey rugs. So it's an example of me perhaps using this gown in ways it was never meant anyway. That doesn't change the fact that bag lining has no real medieval or Renaissance examples, and that's probably because Bag lining means sewing two entirely separate dresses basically and then attaching them. That's double the work. And when you're sewing by hand, you don't want double the work. You just don't. Even if labor is so-called cheap, which is debatable in Florence, that doesn't mean that you necessarily want to pay extra when you don't have to, or you don't want to do extra work if you don't have to, if you are doing said work yourself. So what that means is the bag lining here has resulted in the lining completely wearing away. Not great. You know, it also means that this lining, and this is a part that people who don't move as much as I do in their historical garments maybe wouldn't have experienced, but I have. The bag lining becomes a literal vacuum bag of geologic amounts of detritus. Dust actually gets inside. It works its way through the weave of the fabric because of the action of being dragged across the ground and ends up inside here. And some of you have seen the pictures or videos of the post-event bathtubs where I've soaked dresses like this. And that's in part not because of what's here on the shell fabric, but because of what is in the interior layers of that garment itself. And then that can kind of work its way back towards your legs through motion. So you get this horrible ebb and tide of dirt through your bag lining. So bag lining, I just recommend avoiding it altogether if you are trying to create a historic garment. Why is bag lining done these days? That's a good question. I don't know. It probably has something to do with the factory approach to sewing. If you have any idea why we now bag line garments modernly, please do let me know in the comments below. I would be fascinated to know why. So tip number 3, no bag lining. Alternative methods are flat lining, in which you line each piece before sewing together and then sew all lining and shell together. Or there's other methods where you can actually tack and whip stitch each panel of your lining into the completed garment or the mostly completed garment. This makes it easy to remove linings, like fur, for instance. Or if individual panels wear away, that means you can remove just the one panel instead of having to unsew everything, right? So there's different lining methods that I can recommend, not bag lining. Tip number 4. So we're going to continue on the story of this gown. So this was, as I said, the first ever 15th century Florentine gown that I ever made. I created the pattern entirely myself. I did not do the pattern creation over top of a camicia because I didn't have a camicia at that point, but that's okay. It still fits magically and mysteriously. But the point is that I made many mistakes because there were no other experts on 15th century fashion or sartorial arts anywhere near me. The internet was still a vast wasteland of chat and porn with a little bit more, but still not the kind of details I would have needed at the time. And so I made all sorts of mistakes in my efforts to recreate this gown. First other mistake other than bag lining was the lacing holes. So tip number 4, do not use a hole punch to punch out your lacing holes, ever. Punching out holes, it's not just a question of inauthentic technique. Medieval garments, definitely, lace holes were never punched out. I don't even know if I guess they had die punches, possibly for leather, so they probably could have punched holes in fabric, but that's not the point. The point is that if you punch a hole in the fabric, you create a hole in your fabric. And you don't want holes in your fabric, guys. You don't want holes in your garments. You want to create an opening by using an awl to push the fabric open, keeping all threads intact, not breaking any of those threads, just to stretch them, to manipulate them into a different shape. And in doing so, you end up creating a strong opening because you have all of those threads now in one compact area instead of being spread out across the weave. And then when you finish your hole with appropriate stitches, whether that's a whip stitch or a buttonhole stitch, you end up with basically a fabric grommet, right? But here, you can see these holes were punched. So not only are these holes huge, which you don't really want huge lacing holes, you want lacing holes that are just big enough to take your laces with the egglet on the end, with the chape on the end. Right? So these holes are not only too big, but they're weak spots. And you can see where tight lacing over the years has pulled, and you can see also where the cut edge of the fabric, where I punched that hole and removed that fabric forever, irrevocably, is now coming out of the whip stitches. Whereas if I had just used an awl to push open the fabric, to push open the weave, and then whip stitched the entire thing that way, then there'd be no cut edges to come out. There would be no weak spot. There would be a strong spot, actually. And in fact, I did that all everywhere. Yes. Yes. So I did. I punched holes everywhere. I punched smaller holes on the sleeves. So go me, I guess, because I realized I didn't want big giant holes in my sleeves, in the sleeve lacing, but even still, the same problem. The sleeves don't have nearly as much strain placed upon them as the front opening lacing holes, but still you can see here where fibers are, where edges of the fabric are just popping right out. So tip number 4, please always use an awl to create your lacing holes. And please do not use metal grommets. Metal grommets also punch holes in the fabric, either holes or slices, which are just as bad basically because it's still creating a weakness in your fabric. But also I have never encountered evidence of metal grommets in garments, in medieval and Renaissance garments that are extant. What we do have, if you want to add strength, it's not so much a grommet like you would understand a grommet, but we do have, for example, the farsetto of Diego di Cavanieria, which is an arming/civilian garment. It's meant to be worn as both. You can tell that in how it's constructed, where the skirt of his farsetto, his doublet, actually some of the lacing holes you can tell were used for his hosen, and they're just regular lacing holes punched with an awl, all fabric. But the lacing holes that were used to support his leg harness, his leg armor as you might know it, those have metal rings underneath of the thread. So if you want to add strength to your holes for whatever reason, use the awl to punch it open, and then when you're finishing it, get a metal ring and whip stitch or buttonhole stitch the metal ring into your hole, and there you will have it. Your perfect, extra strong, and also authentic lacing hole, if that matters to you. No judgment from me. You get to choose your level of pain in your historic authenticity. What I choose for me may not be right for you, and that's fine. And I'm sorry if that offends some of the reenactors out there who decided that they get to gatekeep what counts as authentic enough, but authenticity is a spectrum. It is not an absolute, and anyone who says they have an absolutely perfectly authentic garment, they're lying to themselves, because I will bet dollars to donuts they did not, that fibers weren't made from heirloom silkworms using 100% 15th century equipment, that those silkworms were probably not fed a 15th century heirloom variety of mulberry leaves. You see where I'm going with this, right? There is no bottom to how authentic you can get. Okay, soapbox off. Cheeky self-promotion time. If you are enjoying this video, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe and the notification bell if you want to know when I launch new things. And if you want to do more to support my work, then consider the super thanks button on YouTube, or maybe becoming a patron on Patreon, which comes with a whole host of perks and extras like access to premium tutorials, multiple hour ones in fact, and discounts on classes. And now back to your regularly scheduled Contessa. Part B to lacing hole tips. And I guess this might count as tip number 5. Still pertaining to lacing holes, still this gown. When you position your lacing holes, make certain you account for the fact that when you poke the hole will widen. And what I mean is you need to make sure you place your lacing hole, the center of your lacing hole point when you're laying out your lacing holes, far enough from the edge of your garment so that it doesn't push into the edge and kind of make the edge bulge. Because you can see up close here how I really place the hole too close to the edge here on the bottom holes especially, because now the edge kind of bulges out. And if I had just placed the center of the mark for the center of my hole a little further back from the edge, then that would have not happened. You can see there's a little bit of that on all of these. Make sure you place the center point for your lacing hole far enough from the edge that when you poke open the hole, there is still plenty of room for the hole to be created, and still a little bit of protective solid edging that will help reinforce the edge of your opening and create strength for lacing your garment shut. Because let's be honest, if you've got laces in your garment, it's because the garment is tight. and therefore you want it to be strong on the edge. Tip number 6, whatever you plan on doing to your fabric after you create your garment is what you should do to the fabric before you create your garment. This means if you plan on washing your garment in a washing machine by hand, if you plan on putting it in the dryer, you must do all of that to the fabric before you turn it into a garment, because if you do not do that, if you do not pre-wash your fabric, if you do not pre-dry your fabric, but you do post-wash it and you do post-dry it, post being post-creation, you will end up with most likely tears. Most fabrics will have some shrink, and every fabric will be slightly different about how much it will shrink. Wool will not necessarily ever stop shrinking until it is felted because of the nature of wool. And I know I've read some people who say, well, as long as you tumble dry it beforehand, it will be fine. No. I have a friend. She made a beautiful 12th century style wool tunica for her husband. She didn't know this about wool because most of us have never, especially in America, most of us have never actually dealt with real wool in our lives until we get into historical reenactment. Most wools that are available on the market have nylon or something else added to them or aren't real wool, in fact, at all, just made to look like wool. Anyway, this friend of mine made this 12th century garment. Her husband wore it. She decided it needed to be washed, so she washed it. And she took it out of the washing machine, and it was now small enough to fit her. She is about a foot shorter than her husband. Well, she didn't learn her lesson, so she wore it and she got some food on it, and even though that really she should have just scraped it off by hand because that's the beauty of wool, she washed it again. Apparently a slow learner is my friend. And the tunic became small enough for her 10-year-old child, who was significantly smaller than she was. And that's the point at which she stopped trying to wash it. So some fabrics shouldn't be washed manually at all unless you really do want to shrink them down. Wool is one of them. I really recommend a gentle, cold, hand washing, stain treatment only, minimum agitation, because heat and agitation cause the wool fibers to lock on themselves like Velcro and just keep locking and locking and locking and locking. That's how you can felt wool, by the way. That's how you can take very, very thin wool and turn it into a wool so thick that it'll make a very comfortable, luxurious winter home on the Mongolian steppes, if you get my drift. So if you have wool, just don't wash it. That's kind of like tip 5.5 or 6.5. I don't know where we are, whatever number we're on. But for other fabrics even, like silk, like linen, they do have a maximum shrink point generally. So if you plan on laundering these using modern laundering methods after you create your garment, then please do launder them first, because otherwise you might end up with something that won't fit you properly. I made this mistake, and unfortunately I don't have the kirtle anymore. I gave it to someone who was actually the size of the kirtle after I washed it. It was a beautiful white silk damask kirtle, just like the one that Cecily Neville apparently had, that I found in her will. It fits so beautifully underneath of my Franco-Burgundian style overgowns, and the hem got dirty because it's white. It's just what hems do when you wear them, even indoors, because people, especially in different parts of the world, wear shoes indoors, and so they track dirt into the space, and this space had plenty of dirt. And so I lazily washed it. This was many years ago. Learn things I've learned the hard way. I hope you learned from these lessons, ladies and gentlemen. Anyway, I put it in the washing machine, and I think I put it in the washing machine on hot. Well, it came out the size of a child's kirtle. No longer anywhere near the right size for me. I wept bitter tears because that was an entirely hand-sewn kirtle. I think one of my first entirely hand-sewn garments. So learn from my lesson. Please pre-launder your fabrics if you plan on post-laundering them. Whatever you do before, do after. Moving on. Tip number 6 or 7, make certain that when you cut the neckline out, you take into account seam allowance. And also that probably no matter how low you think you've cut that neckline out, it's probably lower than you think. So this gown, you might see there's a panel here in front, an additional panel that I had to add on. So when I cut the neckline of this out, thinking I just knew how low the neckline had to be. Well, I hand sewed this dress, I finished it up, I was wearing it at a 2-week medievalist fair festival event thing called Penzik, and I put it on and it was shockingly low. and there were some knights in camp, and I showed it to them upon my person, and I inquired whether they thought the neckline was too low. They very swiftly informed me that they did not think it was too low at all. Well, ladies and gentlemen, maybe what certain knights think is too low versus what is too low don't exactly overlap. And so I ended up realizing pretty swiftly that even the slightest motion on my part would result in some poppage, shall we say. Thankfully, I had scraps with me at the event of this garment. Very quickly created an insert that I could put to compensate for the too low neckline. And even still, you can see from these images, neckline was still rather low. So you can only imagine how low it was before I added this panel. So please learn from my lessons here and be conservative about how low you cut your neckline. Try it on. You can always cut lower, but adding back fabric is a real pain in the tuchus, if you get my drift, or pain in the bosom, I guess, more literally speaking. Other lessons learned on this one. I also bag lined this girdle. I did not hang them together. And you can see just how much longer the lining is versus the shell fabric, because this wool probably was never really going to stretch very much. It's the particular weave, it's not in its nature. Whereas this linen, tons of stretch, loose weave, lots of bias stretch. The second you end up cutting across the fabric like this, you're cutting through the bias, and you're going to allow parts to just stretch. It's the nature of the diamond, the weave of the fabric, that goes from this to this, right? And that's your bias stretch. Make certain that you hang your garments before you attach lining and fabric. And also, bag lining is not great. My last tip from very sad lessons learned: if you are patterning a garment, creating the pattern yourself, or if you are laying out a pattern on a garment, watch out for the bias stretch. So I have made both mistakes. One, if you pattern your garment on the bias, this means that you will have to lay out all fabric going forward on the bias, or your pattern will not fit. I made a pattern for a lady once, and I was so new at this process that I didn't really think about the fabric being on the bias. It was on the bias. The gown was cut out not on the bias at all, and it did not fit even a little bit. Everything was completely off. So make certain that you don't pattern on the bias, unless you're making like a 20s or 30s style gown. But also, if you are laying out a pattern, make certain that it is with the grain of the fabric, unless the pattern is meant to be laid out on the bias. Otherwise, you will end up with big tears when you go to fit the garment. Okay, well, those have been your tips from my years of sewing mistakes. I'm confident I will think of more for future videos. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Otherwise, until next time, stay creative and stay tuned for your moment of feline felicity. Who's a pretty kitty? Meow meow. Meow meow. 정덕궁 kitty. Meow meow.